Ricardo Tranjan argues that there is no housing crisis, and that, contrary to much of current political discourse, increasing supply alone will not solve a problem that large sections of the population just don't want to fix. My name is Risha Mandelkorn, and on behalf of Aurora Public Library, welcome to a conversation with political economist Ricardo Tranjan. This evening's event is co-sponsored by the Affordable Housing Coalition of York Region. We are grateful for our partnership and for the important work that they do to increase safe, affordable housing options for residents in York Region. Before we explore Ricardo's trailblazing manifesto, the Tenant class, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. I am speaking from the traditional and ancestral lands of the Mississaugas, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee. This gathering place is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, a treaty that bound these sovereign nations to share this territory and protect the land. As settlers and newcomers, we have been invited into this treaty of peace, friendship, and respect to take no more than we need and to share with our neighbors so that we may all have enough. In that spirit, we honor all who came before us, our ancestors, as well as all the Indigenous caretakers, named and unnamed, recorded and unrecorded. So I'm going to begin this evening with a few questions, and then we'll open up the Q&A to what I know will be an important conversation. Please feel free to submit your questions or comments at any time throughout our event, and at the end, we will get to as many of them as we can in the time that's afforded to us. And we will be recording this event as part of the library's archive of author visits. Ricardo Tranjan is a political economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. His current research focuses on the political economy of social policy in Canada, especially rental housing and income supports. His new book, The Tenant Class, has been widely discussed in the Canadian media as a trailblazing and provocative manifesto. Welcome, Ricardo, and thank you so much for being with us this evening. So, are we ready to delve in? Okay, so you begin your book with a quote by Miles Horton and Paulo Freire, two of the most prominent thinkers on social change in the 20th century, by saying, "There's no such thing as neutrality. The people who use that label are people who unknowingly and for the most part are dedicated to the support of the status quo." So for me, this opening quote positions the tenant class as a political, sociological, and economic treatise. Can you speak to that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me today. Thank you for welcoming me. It's a pleasure to be here. Even if it's virtually, it's a great pleasure to be with all of you. What I intended with the book was first and foremost to politicize the housing question in Canada, and politicize not in political party partisan ways, but politicize in the sense that we need to recognize that the system works differently for different people, and that what we have in front of us is a struggle between two groups of people who are enormously benefiting from things the way they are set up right now, and people who are experiencing housing security. So that was the main purpose of the book, and hence that quote, because that quote was to set the stage, to say, you know, what's coming is not a neutral analysis. What's coming is not political or policy options devoid of the political context. What is coming is a political analysis. And at the end, I will, as I did, ask people to pick a side.
Perfect, thank you. In the tenant class, you make the case that Canada doesn't have a housing crisis. but rather a housing market working exactly as intended. In fact, you quote a news article from the Toronto Star that could have been written yesterday that reads, "If rent control were suddenly to cease, many families would suddenly be confronted by the danger of eviction or the necessity to find other accommodation because they could not afford to stay where they were." Now, this article was written in the 1950s, not yesterday or today. How does this fit with our current perception that we are experiencing a housing crisis?
Yes, so let me start by saying that I acknowledge that a lot of people are experiencing very real, very concrete hardship. And my argument against characterizing this hardship or characterizing what we're seeing in housing in Canada as a crisis is not to belittle in any way that hardship, but is to challenge the way we talk about it, because I find it that it's inaccurate, it's misleading, and it's unhelpful. So let me explain you to that. When we talk about a crisis, we tend to think about something that is unexpected and something that comes as a shock. That is not the case with housing in Canada. The structure of our housing system, and especially of the rental housing market, has been the same for many, many decades. There's ups and flows where things get worse. Usually things get worse around recessions, around financial crisis, in times of high inflation that are usually precede times of high interest rates and so on and so forth. But the fundamental structure and these ebbs and flows have been around forever. So this is not unexpected. This is not a shock. That's the first point. The second point, when we talk about a crisis, we also tend to think about something that impacts everyone or most people. Think of COVID. COVID impacted everyone's lives in one way or another. When we talk about a crisis, a humanitarian crisis, an economic crisis, we also tend to think about people who all get impacted more or less directly or indirectly. And again, it's not an accurate way of describing what we're seeing here, right? Because the way the housing system is set up is such that it provides high margins of return on investment. It provides high margins of profit to landlords. It allows for capital gains, a lot of which is not taxed or that is taxed at half measure, and allows overall for wealth accumulation. And there's an entire economic sector, the real estate industry and other players therein. And there's 2/3 of the population who own homes whose values are increasing really fast that are not negatively impacted by this. Who are negatively impacted by this are the tenants and people who are unhoused, who are the ones from whom those profit margins come from. And those are the ones who do not get to keep any of the wealth or capital gains that it's allowed to be produced and generated through all of these processes, right? So I also find misleading the crisis because it affects particularly this one group of people. And thirdly, finally, and most importantly, when we talk about a crisis, we tend to think about something that everyone is interested in solving, because no one likes a crisis. So we want to bring everyone together and we're going to try and figure this thing out, and we want it to go away. Again, COVID, it's a sort of a suitable and recent example, and that is particularly not true with the housing system right now. There are lots of people, especially lobbyists and pundits associated with the real estate industry, who are very actively engaged in keeping things the way they are. Some of them are actually proposing measures that would make things worse for tenants. And so to pretend that this is just a policy puzzle and what we're missing here is some sort of clever ideas that we need to bring the experts in the room and we're going to all find sort of a solution for this, it's misleading, because there's actually a lot of people playing against changing things in any considerable or substantial way. So for all of these reasons, I challenge the notion of a crisis, and I invite folks to think more about it as a fundamental political struggle between people who stand to benefit and become quite wealthy out of this, and people who are at the risk of losing their homes.
So Ricardo, we hear the narrative of supply and demand. And if we listen to our politicians at various levels, we hear that if we build more housing, we're going to solve the problem of the lack of housing. But there's something wrong with this narrative. Can you elaborate on it?
Yes. First, let me start by saying that I'm not against supply. I think supply is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And to pretend that it's sufficient is disingenuous, or disingenuous at best. Let's just say that. Let's just leave it at that. So yeah, we need to be constantly building more homes, because our population is constantly growing. Either the population grows through immigration and through natural birth, or to long life expectancy. Kind of doesn't matter. Over the past 20 years, growth has been quite steady and quite, when you take more than 1 year and you do like 3, 5, 10-year averages, growth has been quite consistent. So yes, we need to continue to build houses to accommodate everyone. Does building housing make it more expensive? Does building housing make it more affordable? Not necessarily. What you build, where you build, who owns it, who gets to speculate with the land on which it was built, the kind of regulatory frameworks that we put in place, all of that matters, and matters a great deal if your desired outcome is affordability. And that's a big assumption, at least from my part, that we want affordability. So if you want affordability, all of those things are very important too. And what you do or don't do in that front, it's very important. So I find regretful that now we have the leaders of at least two parties, if not more, at the federal level, going around and scapegoating municipalities, going around and saying, this little town here, every municipal official got in the way of building housing. We didn't build housing, and that's why houses are expensive. That is not accurate. That is extremely misleading, especially coming from folks at the federal level, because they should know that the CMHC, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, went through very profound transformations throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, and that the CMHC has been responsible for injecting an enormous amount of credit into the market that has allowed and has actually pushed people into indebting themselves a really high and risky ways, and that has enormously contributed to the cost of housing in this country. And so to blame on municipalities, and I'm not defending municipalities either, there's some really bad choices that were made there, but to simply scapegoat them and to provide this easy solution, it's misleading. And I am worried that folks listen to this, folks who are experiencing housing security, or folks who are hoping to access home ownership soon, and kind of maybe led to think that in a couple of years things are going to be much better. Unfortunately, that is not the case, especially for low and moderate income folks who would like housing that is not simply built, but is housing that is affordable. And the last thing I would say is, for folks who are renting, they know that they're renting a place already, right? Most folks, or you talk renters that you talk to, they have a place, they are housed. And they also maybe know the other place that they would like to move to. They visit, they saw the ad. The problem is not the place existing or being there or not. The problem is the amount of rent that is being charged for it. And rents are growing really fast because landlords are taking advantage of the opportunity of this context to increase rent a lot. Even in provinces that have rent controls, we're seeing kind of maneuvers around rent controls to kind of keep rents going up by more than, according to my perspective, they should. So yes, it's misleading to blame everything supply, and we need a more serious conversation about it.
Thank you. Ricardo, the term class refers to a shared socioeconomic status, but there are rich tenants and there are poor tenants. Are they part of the same class structure? I think I'm getting into some interesting political theory here.
Yes, I think so. I think so. I use the term class for two reasons. One is because in trying to politicize the issue, I find the language of class easy because it's already there. It's always easier to have a conversation with terms that people already know, people already kind of relate to, have heard before. So in that attempt to politicize housing, I thought that was going to be a useful schema to allow people to kind of understand what I was trying to say. And also it has to do with my own background. I'm a political economist by training, and also Latin American and Latin Americanist. And in that school of thought, in the South and in political economy, it's kind of somewhat common that scholars will borrow concepts more freely because they don't always apply to our realities, right? And like a lot of this theory was originally written for and in the European context, and sometimes they travel and sometimes they don't. They travel well, sometimes they don't. But Latin Americanists have, usually felt really free to run with it as long as run with it and adapt it as long as it suits a political agenda, as a political project. So that's one reason for using it. The second reason is that I do think the term is applicable even in the most traditional Marxist kind of sense, because for classic Marxist theory, the fundamental determinant of a class is in relation to the means of production, right? Do you own the machines? Do you own the factory? Or do you own your own labor and you have to sell your labor in order to make a living? And that's the fundamental distinction. That's the traditional distinction. And some people, colleagues and friends, have criticized me for deviating to that, because according to Marx and especially to Engels, who wrote about this, the rent and the housing relations, they happen at the point of consumption, not at the point of production. So they are not equally important or equally fundamental determinant of class. To that, my usual response is that I think that's a very gendered and outdated definition. I think that it puts too much emphasis on production and not enough emphasis on reproductive labor. When we think about reproductive labor as being equally important to productive labor, we say, okay, we have means of production here, and here you have sort of the household, right? Or some form of collective or individual household where all the reproductive labor takes place. So aren't they similar? I think there's something to be further elaborated there. And also because the notion of financialized capitalism, right? So production at the time, some of this classical work was written, it was pretty basic, the basic way of extracting surplus from workers. Nowadays, and you needed to kind of own, industry and land and nowadays in order to be able to borrow money and then invest more and then put more people to work and so on and so forth. Today, it's much simpler to get a loan. Like anyone who has like a mortgage and that is not even paid can go to the bank and get another mortgage and buy a second property and put some tenants there and start extracting income from them. So for a number of reasons, I think the term is useful. Last thing to say, and to answer your question directly, within the working class or the proletariat, as traditionally called, there were also better and worse paid employees. And that was never a problem in terms of thinking of them as belonging to the same class, because what was more important was the relationship with the means of production, with capital. And I think with tenants is the same thing, from low-income tenants to high-income tenants. The fundamental point is that they don't own it, and they are their income is being extracted to allow someone else to accumulate capital gains and revenues and eventually wealth.
So Ricardo, before I ask the last of my prepared questions, I'm going to invite the audience to look at the bottom of their screen and type in their questions or comments or observations in the Q&A. But before we go to those, I want to ask, in your book, you make the case for why it's time tenants, and I'll quote you, organize, mobilize, and fight back. This is usually, rallying cry for labor on the picket lines. So, what is the end game of this with regard to housing? Are all landlords greedy corporations? Is there a middle ground that could affect positive change, positive social change? Or is it really a black and white dichotomy? I'm really interested to hear your take on this one.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way the book is structured, the first chapter makes that point about then this is no housing crisis. The second one talks about the tenant class. The third one talks about the landlord class. Goes after some myths in both cases. And then the fourth and the fifth chapter are devoted to organizing and tenant groups. Canada actually has a very interesting and rich history of tenant organizing. Tenants have organized for a very, very long time. I use examples of, Prince Edward Island before the Confederation, and throughout the 20th century, you see a lot of organizing. And this organizing has been very important in two fronts. It has been important with very concrete and immediate fights, usually fights against rent hikes, against evictions, or in demanding repairs and better conditions for the units and the buildings and so on and so forth. But also when you take a step back and you look throughout the 20th century and you look at moments where tenant activism was very strong, you also see that there are some high level policies that change. Right, and I talk about them, especially in BC, all the rent protections that came in place, like in the early 1970s. They were short of what the tenant movements were asking, but they were kind of many steps in the right direction. In Ontario, you also have similar things happening in Quebec, and so. I think that that's why tenant activism is so important. The question of all greedy landlords, are all landlords greedy? I don't know what share of landlords are greedy or not. When you look at the averages of how much rents are going up by, you can tell that profiteering, as we call, exists, and it's widespread. You can tell also that. And there's good research there from Martin August, Julie Ma, and others, looking at the new models of landlord, like the real estate investment trusts especially, and that their models kind of geared towards profiteering and some predatory practices. But I think if there are landlords there, they're not predatory, they're not greedy, they're just like decent people running businesses. I think they would just not mind tenant organizing. They would just not mind all the protections and regulations that tenants are demanding right now. And I think the labor market is the perfect example of this. We have a minimum wage law that doesn't impact a lot of employers, because they simply say, I'm not going to pay $14 an hour to my workers. I know people can't live on this. I'm not going to build an entire, firm or enterprise of any sort based on cheap labor. That's not what I'm here to do. I want to make a good living for my family. I want to contribute to my community, but I want my employees to have a decent standard of living too. So when you pass rules about the minimum number of sick days that people would have, a lot of employers said, yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to make a parent work sick and not take care of their children. My employees have sick days too. That's great. And so often the legislation that we demand for workers and that we're demanding for tenants, there's sort of a based sort of just floor that we want to make sure that it's there, so that we prevent any predatory practice, that we prevent profiteering and all of those things. But I assume that when we have stronger protections in place, a lot of landlords won't mind They're like, yeah, sure, like we already operated that way. If you put in law or not, it doesn't matter. We're going to continue to be decent people. The other day I was on a radio show and we were talking about rent strikes, and the radio, I think the producer had set up so that, we have tenants calling in favor of rent strikes and landlords calling against it. And there's this landlord that calls and says, no, I'm absolutely with the tenants, in solidarity with them. I'm in favor of rent controls. Yes, I have only 1 unit or 2 units. I'm a small landlord, but they make more than, pay for themselves. I'm doing fine. I don't need to be increasing rents by 10% a year. That's not what this is. I'm fine. And I'm on the side of tenants. But great, they exist. They're out there.
So our audience is starting off with a really interesting discussion question, and I can't wait to hear your answer on this one. Richard says, I feel for the person who invested 3 years ago to invest in a long-term rental property. 3 years ago, it was 25-year mortgage before owning the property. With all of the new interest rate hikes, it's now a 52-year ownership plan. With a landlord only being able to increase rent by 2.5% yearly, it's not enough to pay the bills on the property. Would love to know what you think. Thank you, Richard, and over to you, Ricardo.
Thank you, Richard, for the question. I find it's important to first treat it as a business, as an investment, right? When we talk about landlords, we often, and I'm not saying that's what Richard's doing here, but we often sort of romanticize a little bit, or we make it personal, talking about that individual, that family. No, this is a business. This is an investment. This person, got that investment property because they were told, they were made believe, and I think there's a problem there with our investment advisors and all of that real estate is a great investment option. Real estate is guaranteed return, little to no risk. That's the word on the street. And it's unfortunate that that's the word on the street, because there are some risks in there, and there should be. If you're trying to have high returns, there should be risk, and those risks should not be pushed down onto tenant families, and which is often what happens depending on the province, on the kind of regulatory framework that you're operating. So what I say is that person is going to have a higher operating cost than expected. A lot of people, when they do this kind of investment, they expect that they can save just for the down payment, and then after the thing is going to pay for itself, and then in the end of it, someone else bought them a home, right? You put 5% down, someone else paid the 95% rest of your mortgage, and you're good to go. You have 2 properties by the time you're retired. You're pretty secure. What happened is that interest rates went up, the operating costs are going to be higher, okay? Does this mean that this person is going to lose money? Not necessarily, and most likely not. If the person can weather through however many years, 3, 5 of high interests are cyclical, they're going to eventually go down, and then their operational costs are going to be low. Maybe they're going to break even again. And then in the long run, again, they get a house for free. I'm sorry, but you get a house paid for by someone else, right? And the capital gains on that properties are going to be pretty high, and they're most likely more than make up for any operational loss that you had for 2, 3, 4, 5 years even, right? If the person does not have the cash flow capacity to absorb that high operational costs, so let's say that now, because of the new interest and because of the mortgage, they now have to put $300-400 more a month to kind of break even. If the person doesn't have the capacity to do that, I'm sorry, but that investment was a really bad idea. It was a really bad choice. And I'm sorry for the person. I'm sorry for whoever told them that they should do this, because it's really bad idea. Because investments, especially high return investments like real estate, have some risk, and the person needs to be able to absorb the risk. So if they don't have that cash flow to absorb the operational, and they sell right now, most likely they're still going to make money, because prices have gone up in the past 3 years, and they have gone up significantly. I don't know what market the person is, but that. So even if they say, "Oh shit, like this is, I can't continue to do this, I'm gonna have to sell," I bet you that most likely than not, that person's gonna make a capital gain at the end of this whole thing. And capital gains, even in your second property, are taxed at a 50% margin. So you're not even going to pay that much taxes on this. You pay less taxes on that capital gain than on employment income. People who went out 6 o'clock in the morning, worked all day, came back, get a paycheck, they pay more taxes than that person. So in that sense, I think this is my take on it.
So in a very concrete and positive direction, Yvonne asks, what are 2 or 3 of the best policy levers that could be used to regulate the financialization of housing?
Okay. So on thinking about real estate, thinking about rental housing, I think there has been already a motion put forward by the member of the Green Party, Mike Morris, asking for the government to take away the financial treatment, the special tax treatment that real estate investment trusts benefit from. That in practice, what is likely to do is to sort of make that business model of REITs, as we call them, unsustainable. And so I think that would be a positive move towards not having that kind of operation, because that kind of operation is based on essentially speculation, right? So I think you would kind of do away with speculation. I think that also for the smaller kind of landlords, I think there's something to be said about a different tax treatment on capital gains on housing. And there's a discussion on whether that should apply only to second and third homes, or even be applied also to principal residences. I think that conversation is really important. I think overall, I think it's unfortunate that in this country, we tax more, as I just mentioned, employment income than capital gains. So right now, principal residents are exempt from capital gain taxes. So if it's it's the only one house that you own and the one that you live in, when you bought for an X amount, you sold for 3 times more, that 2x, the difference between what you bought and what you sell, you pay 0 taxes on it. There's the conversation of, should you pay some taxes on it? And the argument there is that a lot of the valuation of your home has to do with the land and not with the actual built-in property, right? So even if you work hard and keep your house in a good state of repairs, and that's important, that's great. What made the home be that much more valuable is the land in all the amenities and ameliorations around the land. Transit, recreation centers, infrastructure of various kinds, population growth, and so on and so forth. Essentially nothing that you did it yourself. These are public investments that everyone paid for. And yet, through their taxes, everyone paid for those things, you included, but you as much as everyone else. And so there's an argument that why should you be able to walk away with like these windfall gains, as economists call them? Why shouldn't a portion of this be taxed to be reinvested in public services and other things? So I think that the question of taxation of principal and secondary, and definitely secondary and third and other homes are important. And then the only other thing I would say, it's also it has to do with investing more directly in non-market housing. So non-market housing it's a general term that captures social housing that is usually owned and managed by government, includes co-ops who are like self-managed, includes non-for-profit housing providers. All of this we kind of bundle into this umbrella term, non-market housing. Those are the homes that are more affordable for sure, for like considerably more affordable. The statistics show that there's long tenure in them, meaning tenants stay much longer in those homes. So if we had a much larger share of the total rental housing stock to be non-market, that would be really, really positive for the affordability front in terms of, and also in terms of providing people more security. Canada, when you look at comparatively to other countries, we have a very small share. It's about 4%. About 4% of our housing is outside of the market. It's not for profit one way or another. When you compare it to other countries, you go up to 30 and 40%. If you move towards, like, if you put it like, especially the OECD countries, so like by and large, like comparable Western, Northern developed nations, Canada is really low in that sort of rank. And so increasing that significantly would be really positive as well.
Well, before we get to the next question, I'll share a comment that one of our attendees made, which is, sounds like playing the stock market.
It is, and you lose money, don't you, when you do that? Or you gain. There's,
The next question is, in the news today, I heard evictions are up 77% for personal landlord use. Do you believe this is happening so they can now increase their monthly rental rent to new tenants? Is this a loophole?
It's likely. Unfortunately, we do not have the data to back up that hypothesis. So to folks who don't know what land use evictions are, basically there are different two different sets of reasons that you can, three different sets of reasons that you can evict a tenant. One, and the most straightforward, is non-payment, right? The tenant fell into arrears. The second one is other things related to the tenant's behavior or damage to the property, complaints for other neighbors, and so on and so forth. And those are at fault evictions. It's like when you're fired and it's your own fault for being fired, right? And then there's this term, personal use kind of category. And that personal use category is when tenants are evicted, or they're sort of told that they have to leave because the landlord will use the unit themselves. It can be them themselves who are going to use it, or it can be a family member that is going to move in, and so on and so forth. So the legitimate case would be someone, you moved out of the country for work and for many years, and then now you're coming back. In the same story, I rented to you while I was gone. Now my family's back in Canada. I need the property back. Or you say, oh, I have the second property. Now one of my kids got married or is about to have a child. I told them they can live, in my house for a number of years until they kind of their own feet kind of thing. So you can do that. So the problem is that we know that land a personal use category has been misused in a number of cases. In provinces, even in the provinces where we have rent controls on the occupied units, there is no rent controls on the vacant units. That's what folks call vacancy decontrol, meaning between tenancies, you can increase rents by however much you want. In Ontario, according to the latest data from the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, on average, rents go up by 27% between tenants. So that is an enormous financial incentive to push tenant out, because you can charge that much more to the next tenant. Again, 27 is the average. Again, it means some people do a lot less because they don't think it's necessary, or the market conditions don't allow them to kind of push them that much, or because they say, like, it's unfair and I'm not going to do that. But also means that some people do even more than 27%, right? Because that's just the average. So the vacancy decontrols create they put pressures up on rent over time, but they also create this huge financial incentive for pushing people out. So that's why folks might have heard the term renovictions. It's another type of that. It's when, because including the personal use, sometimes you can push the tenants out if you say you need to do some major renovation and it's going to take a very long time, and it's so major that people cannot be living there while you're doing it. So you say that's why you need to leave, because I'm going to renew the entire place. And there has been a number of contested evictions where the tenant, sort of just went by the house 2 months later, saw that all was done was a fresh coat of paint, a new IKEA corner, a counter, and then it was rented again by a lot more. So that's something we're dealing with. And so that's the context for people who hear the term renovictions and so on and so forth. And there's, to the point of the question, there's a suspicion that a lot of this personal use evictions are fraudulent. And I think BC is the province of British Columbia. The government is trying to crack down on this. So to the point of policies and solutions, they're trying to crack down on this by making the penalty more strict. Should someone find out that you did that, the penalties are going to be harsher.
So Alan says good evening, and he says, you mentioned Latin America, which in the past gained a reputation for great inequality. Does Canada seem to be heading towards that? And conversely, does the political and economic environment in the South, such as what led to Minha Casa, Minha Vida in Brazil, lead to a healthier housing market and a better future than here?
So thank you, Alan. Good evening. What worries me is that more and more wages don't buy houses. Houses buy more houses. More and more you see that even two-income households of people with sort of professional jobs, so we're talking about people kind of like in the 40 to 20% top earners, it's really hard for them now to put the down payment necessary for a house and to absorb the mortgage in their on an ongoing basis. So more and more we see that first-time home buyers are relying on gifts or loans from family who owns house, and who either borrow against it or some way tap into that equity to provide a chance for their kids and grandchildren and so on to also access home ownership. So that for me is a very disconcerting trend. If we get to a point that essentially the only way to buy a house is to have rich parents or parents who own homes, I think we're definitely in the wrong path in terms of inequality. If either owning or securing through rent a decent housing, if that is not possible, just with your employment income, I think it sets us to a really bad path. Talking about the programs in Brazil, Minha Casa, Minha Vida, and others. These are large. Like Canada has had similar programs in the past, in the sense that the Canadian government has led kind of like more direct construction efforts to increasing the housing supply, but not only of any house anywhere, but like housing that was targeted at low and moderate income earners, that was targeted to the veterans coming back from Second World War. I live in a neighborhood of Ottawa, Manor Park, with a lot of Manor Park, and then the kind of Beechwood Village by here, where a lot of the housing was built And they were simple or and row houses or detached homes. There were modular homes, and they were more directly require more directly government intervention, but they got built, and a lot of families grew up in those houses and had good lives. And so, but now governments are more afraid of doing this. We're constantly, kind of providing more and more subsidies to the private sector and saying like, you do that. The problem is the private sector, yeah, they have the expertise, but also they're only in it for profits and returns. And if the math doesn't add up, they either don't build it or they sell it for a lot or they charge a lot of rent. And so it doesn't deliver in the same way. And I think we were very excited with the Liberal government in 2015 because they kind of signal that the federal government was going to come back into the housing business. And then in 2007, they developed a strategy. But me and many of my colleagues got quite disappointed in that because they didn't get into the housing business the way we hoped, like that kind of like direct intervention. And the entire national housing strategy has been fundamentally about providing subsidized loans to private developers, asking them to have some discounted units in the mix, and that hasn't quite delivered. And then even now with the new rhetoric and new minister, we haven't changed the approach in any kind of significant way, unfortunately. So yeah, I think more direct state intervention has worked in the past.
So I want to thank our guest for the question that I'm going to pose to you right now, because I think it's a very compassionate one. On a personal level, what can I do to contribute change regarding housing? I feel like in recent years, there's been such a hopeless atmosphere about the unaffordability of housing and how it relates to other economic issues Canada is facing. Thank you for that question. Ricardo, over to you.
Thank you. In the book and elsewhere, I encourage folks to organize politically, to participate in the political struggle for housing. And that, can look differently depending where you are in many aspects. What I try to tell folks is that this is not a policy puzzle. And I think, unfortunately, too much of the media coverage on this and too much of the the politicians and the way they communicated, and also because of pundits and researchers and like myself, I think that's often the impression that people have, that this is really complex and it's really, we don't know what to do and what should we do it. And again, you need to be an expert to kind of, weigh in and so on and so forth. And again, I find that extremely misleading. The book, and I'm sorry for the spoiler if anyone is considering reading the book, but the book ends with a quote from a 1948 research report from the Canada Housing and the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the CNHC, where the head researcher says the private sector will not deliver housing for low and moderate income families. We need a direct investment from and direct engagement from the federal government, from non-market housing providers, and so on and so forth, So we have known the solutions for so long. We know that we need a larger share of the rental market to be not for profit. We know that we need to be building housing that it's not only single detached homes, that they're somewhere in the middle and they're like entry-level homes for people who are trying to buy it. We know that for people who are in the rental market, they need rent controls so rents don't increase more than their wages. We're just not willing to implement these policies. We're not willing to tell the real estate industry, who is holding the entire country hostage at gunpoint, say like, you can't do this, you can't be the only industry making that sort of investment at that sort of return at the detriment of not only families but also of other sectors of the economy. And that's another conversation. When people spend too much money in housing, they don't spend money in everything else, including activities that are much more laborers and that generate a lot more employment, get a lot less. But that's a parenthesis. So to answer the question more directly, I think I would encourage you to participate in some political movement. For a lot of tenants, that means join a tenant union. If there's not a tenant union in your area, you can start one. If you don't know how to start one, my advice is reach out to any tenant union. Reach out to me, and I will put you in contact with the tenant union close to you. There's a lot of solidarity among tenants, organized tenants. I know they are supporting each other across the country to form these unions and to organize more and more tenants and to collect and to carry on collective actions. If the tenant union is not your thing, there are some more sort of umbrella movements. So if in Quebec, there's FRAPU and there's HACLAC. If in Toronto, there's the FMTA. If you like in Vancouver, there's the Vancouver Tenant Union. Depending where you're connecting, that's that. In Ontario, usually ACORN is one of the organizations that has a broader reach. Or engage with the politicians in whatever party you support. There's also an engagement there to ask them more hardball questions and tell them, no, supply will not solve this. Are you willing to implement rent controls? Are you willing to shift the narrative and start building non-market housing, start building social housing again? Are you willing to go, to make a clear statement against the financiers and the people who are sucking all the money out of the system? So whatever party you are engaged with, or if you want to engage with, ask these hard questions and not buy into like, we're going to invest in supply, everyone's going to be happily ever after. That's not going to work. So these are some of the another idea. It's kind of like some of the work that I'm doing. If you're a unionized worker, talk to your unions, push that debate internally within your labor union, because there's a number of us trying to get labor back into this conversation. Labor has a lot of resources, a lot of footprint, and in the past, labor was more engaged in the fight for decent homes and for affordable rent. They have withdrawn in the past decades for a number of reasons. We're trying to bring labor back. I will be speaking at the Ontario Federation of Labor next convention now in November, and that's what I'm going to tell everyone in the room. You guys need to come back to this. And others are saying that too. So that's another venue that you could use. But it's political. Whatever you do, it's political. Don't waste your time developing a policy with your community group and trying to send that policy to some. No, like, knowledge is not the missing link. It's the political fights that we need.
So I think most of us in this virtual space this evening are on the same page. We want to see change. So I think this is an excellent question. What advocacy can we engage in to send a strong message to the federal government that subsidizing for-profit developers who only provide barely, if at all, a small number of affordable units for a short time frame of 20 years is an egregious use of federal taxpayer dollars?
Yeah, that's a great point. I agree with that. And they just did it again. They just exempt private developers from the GST taxes, from that portion of the GST. Yeah, I think there's a number of movements sort of trying to organize against that. There was a lot of for against the GST. I was impressed at the GST rebate. So for those who don't know it, a couple of weeks ago, the federal government announced that in order to incentivize supply, it will exempt developers from paying the GST And then a number of other provinces kind of announced that they will do the same and also remove their part. So they're getting this tax break of between 13 and 15%. And arguably is a great measure because we will provide them more incentives to, because this is for building purpose-built apartment units. So the argument is that we provide an incentive for them to build more of that and less of condos and other kinds of housing that is not as affordable and not necessarily geared towards renting. And I was impressed that there was a lot of pushback. There was more pushback than I assumed, meaning the consensus is not as strong as it used to be. There's especially, I read a lot of Quebec news too, and in Quebec there's a lot of articles saying wrong way, wrong way, wrong way. In Ontario, there was some of that pushback. I saw some pushback also in the Pacific side of things as well. So just a week ago, 2 weeks ago, we were on streets. I was Frapu, which is a Quebec organization, was here in Ottawa, and they organized a demonstration on the streets saying that asking for social housing money specifically. So not to be too repetitive, but same as my previous comment, find a channel for political pushback. Please do not spend your time, and I'm talking myself out of a job here, but please don't spend your time and resources and energy on policy debates. Sometimes I see very well meant community groups kind of trying to get together and put out their time in like developing a proposal for how to get data on Airbnbs and develop a proposal on how to regulate Airbnbs. There's plenty of knowledge about this internationally. There's academic journals written about how to regulate Airbnb. Like, and it's not, it's not that proposal, unfortunately, that we're going to change. Organize a demonstration, organize your neighbors, reach out to through this channel, maybe there are 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 community organizations in Aurora that you can sort of bring around the table and say, we're going to have 3 demands for housing. That's it. 3 demands for housing for all levels of government. And we have particularities, things that we prefer, that we're going to put aside our differences. We're going to have these 3 goals, and we're just going to hammer it. In every municipal elected official, in every provincial elected official, and anyone from the federal government that drives by this town, and we're going to connect with other movements, and that's what we're going to do. It's political. Think about organizing political action, not policy ideas. Again, I'm talking myself out of a job, but.
So as I see no open questions, I'm going to, in my head, count my 5 seconds to see if anybody is furiously typing away, because I feel really terrible if I end an event and somebody is in the middle of asking a question. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're good. As our evening comes to an end, I would like to thank Ricardo Tranjan for such a timely and important conversation. I'd like to thank the Affordable Housing Coalition of York Region, most especially Yvonne Kelly, because she's the one that brought this book to my attention before it was even published, for their commitment to housing as a right rather than as a commodity. I would like to thank Lucy Frechette, who's been behind the scenes as tech support. And I would like to thank you, our guests, for your intelligent contributions to the discussion and for spending your evening with us. Good night and stay safe, everybody.
Thank you. So the book was originally meant as a resource for tenant groups and for community groups. That's what I was fundamentally thought I was doing, right? And it was, as you know, it's even a short book. It's hard work, and I'm spread thin in my day job, so I did a lot of the writing in the evening, after putting the 6-year-old and the newborn to bed with my spouse. But that was my main motivation, right? I was like, there's so many good people out there organizing and trying to fight for this. and I've been told by folks that I tested the waters with that this is going to be a useful resource. So, why I'm flattered and I really appreciate the kind of the attention that this got from like big media and from a bunch of venues that I didn't expect it to be at or to be invited to come. And it's great, and I love that it's getting that kind of attention. But this kind of thing that we did tonight, that is actually kind of the soul of what I was thinking and the reason why I did it. So that's all my way of saying that I was really happy to be here too, and thank you for the invitation.